Hello, Internet. It's Daniel, Driving and Dragons, and I'm back again, this time to talk about some more positive aspects of world building, some world building tips. Now, bear with me, please. I'm a little under the weather right now, so hopefully I can get this recorded in an understandable fashion without too much nasaliness and whatnot from a good old-fashioned fall cold. And on the 280ZX, we will be swapping out the ignition coil. It finally came in, and I'm hoping that that will fix the issues with the spark, so that I can get it to start, so that I can run it and drive it again. Be another step closer to the end on that particular project. I do also have an announcement to make. I will be, at least tentatively, joining the RPG Pundit on his show to have a little bit of a discussion on Sunday. So be looking forward to that, having some long form discussion. A lot of you guys know that debate and discussion of different facets of the hobby are a big part of what I think is important for the overall growth of what we enjoy doing. And that's really hard to do in Twitter. It's really difficult to do in response videos because a lot of times you don't have the other person anywhere near handy, so that you inevitably end up straw manning a lot of arguments, or even if you're not necessarily straw manning them, if you misunderstand them, you build an entire case and you don't, a lot of people whistle past each other when it comes to response videos, and then comment sections, the same deal. It's very difficult in text to detect emotion, to see how people are reacting, to catch whether or not there's other nuance that you're missing. So I do think that a lot of the discussions that happen on live streams and whatnot are actually some of the most productive use of time in the hobby. That being said, we're going to go ahead and get moving on here with these 6 tips for world building. These are world building shortcuts that can help your game hit that next level. All right. So our first tip is going to be pallet swapping. Pallet swapping is a great way to save time and minimize workload in your world building. You may say to me, well, Daniel, didn't you say that pallet swapping was a mistake in your last video? I did, but a lot of it depends on what you're swapping and where you're saving that time. So to give an example is the Renault F1 Espace. The Renault Espace is a minivan. It is what they call a people carrier. Well, the French company that makes that minivan, Renault, had a championship F1 car that they decided, for publicity reasons and to celebrate the success of this minivan, they made a carbon fiber minivan with 6 racing seats and dropped it on top of their F1 car, and they basically made a crazy minivan that does 0 to 60 in 2.1 seconds and is capable of 180 miles an hour and all kinds of other craziness. They essentially pallet swapped in their F1 car. They just took an F1 car and they swapped the minivan for the rest of the body. If they were trying to put this out there and tell everybody, oh yeah, it's definitely a minivan, it's absolutely a minivan, it's just a regular minivan, nobody would buy it, because all of the evidence says race car, and the only thing that says minivan is this crazy carbon fiber contraption with a bunch of wings and aerodynamics that sits, half inch off the ground. But if what they were doing was trying to create a reality in which minivan racing is a thing, then it makes sense. So how does this relate to your tabletop role-playing game? Well, imagine instead of race car and minivan, you have different races or classes. In this world, we don't have any elves, but we do have a race that is very, very similar to elves. Why am I going to try to go through all the trouble of game designing an entirely bespoke race to fit this group that I've made when I don't have elves in this world? So all I need to do is a little palette swapping. I take the elf statistics from core game and I apply the coat of paint for my world, make whatever little minor adjustments I need to do to fit that flavor a little bit better, and call it a day. This can be done with a lot of different mechanics in a lot of different ways in your tabletop role-playing games, and it can save you a lot of time and effort. So another example would be, If, let's say, you're using a Dungeons and Dragons D20 based system, you got a bunch of players who are used to Dungeons and Dragons, but you're trying to make a cybernetic, sci-fi, cyberpunk system. Well, you don't really have any magic, or you may have some magic, but what you do have is this cybernetic enhancement you can get for your arm, where it turns your arm into a flamethrower. Well, rather than try and create its own kind of statistics and whatnot, just poured in a burning hand spell through a wand or something, only instead of a wand, it's a cybernetic arm. And you start with that base and then you make the adjustments. That also allows you, if you have like kind of a unique ability or something that you're wanting to have granted to something in your game world for the flavor of the world itself, it gives you an idea of what adjustments you need to make, because it kind of, if you have like, say, a leveling system, it tells you what level characters should be. If you don't have a leveling system, it's all an expense system, and you compare it to price. I know if whatever this ability is in this medieval fantasy world that I'm putting together using the interlock system from Cyberpunk, if it equates to something that costs 15,000 eddies, I know that that should be more of a mid to late game thing, not something that they get early on. So I'm palette swapping in those rules to make it easier. This also makes it easier in the game context of you're bringing your players in. All right, I got this great new world. I want to do all this stuff, and here's how this people work, and here's how these people work. If I can tell a player, these people, this is what they're like in game, and they use the same statistics as the elf out of the player's handbook, I don't have to worry about answering a bunch of questions about their abilities. I just told them. Game rules, they're an elf. So if you want to make your character, make an elf. This is an easy way to kind of shorthand in a few things to save yourself a lot of time on the back end developing classes, races, abilities, equipment, whatever it may be. I'm going to give an example of something that does this very, very well, and that is an adventure module that people have heard me speak about before on the channel called 3 Days to Kill. It's from Penumbra Games. It was from the early 2000s, and it was an original 3rd edition Dungeons & Dragons open gaming license game. It is essentially a Tom Clancy Rainbow Six style Navy SEAL infiltration mission, reskinned as Dungeons & Dragons. The players are given a wand of fireball with 1 charge instead of an RPG. They're given 3 sleep arrows instead of some tear gas or knockout gas canisters. They're given a bag of pebbles that pop and cause a bright light that gives a minus to all rolls instead of being given flashbangs. They're given a monocle that can be used to zoom and can be tapped to look through walls and can see heat instead of being given night vision goggles. Basically, they just got in and they said, we want to do Tom Clancy Rainbow Six. We need night vision goggles. We need knockout gas. We need flashbangs. We need the rocket launcher to cause some chaos. What are the D&D equivalents of these things? And then they palette swapped them to put them in the game, and it was very successful. Next up on our shorthand tips to help world building go smoother is historical shorthand. Now, historical shorthand, what I'm talking about here is when you have an idea for what you want to have happening in your world, the political climate you want, the wars, the brewing conflicts, the political intrigue, whatever that case may be, chances are there's something very similar that exists somewhere in history amongst the human race that you can kind of put into your game to kind of help you build a framework for that world building. If you understand why World War I happened and why it was always going to happen and why it was inevitable, it's very easy for you to brew or build that world-spanning global conflict in your own world. So one of the things you can do if you've got an idea in mind for how you want your game to go, for what kind of climate you want to have happening around these characters, for what you want influencing your players and their decisions, is you just take a look at history and you find a historical example of something similar happening and you plug that into your game, making the minor adjustments where it is. You'll notice a theme with these tips that I'm giving here. Usually the way that you do a shorthand is, or you do a shortcut to your world building to make things a little easier for yourself, is you take something that is more or less similar to what you're trying to do, you polish it, you tweak it, you make the necessary adjustments so that you don't commit some of those problems that we talked about in the last video, you plug them in. So for instance, I might take something about the Napoleonic Wars, and I look at the things that caused the Napoleonic Wars to happen. I look at the things that led to the French Revolution. I look at that political climate. I plug in the French as a stand-in for my elves, and I plug in the dwarves over there in England, and I plug in the humans in various different European nations, and the orcs in some other European nation. And then I go ahead and I apply those attitudes, and I already have my whys in place. All I have to do is make the necessary adjustments to where they fit to my world, to where they don't come across as anachronistic. And, you know, of course, the little tweaks that'll help throw a blanket over things a little bit. You don't want people stepping into your game world and saying, oh, well, this is the War of the Roses. It's one of the big problems with George R.R. Martin's writing. It's not really a secret. Anybody who's listened to my channel knows that I think George R.R. Martin is a complete hack. And that's because all Game of Thrones is a fantasy version of the War of Roses, or the Wars of Roses, rather, with a bunch of gratuitous sex added in for virtually no reason, and a few other historical events that are not necessarily part of the War of the Roses thrown on top, and then some dragons and some undead monsters added in. That's basically the entirety of Game of Thrones. All he did was take the Wars of the Roses, tweak a few things, add a couple of fantastic elements, make the adjustments to make those fantastic elements make sense and how they would affect the world at large, and then start writing it, never finish writing it, and then sell it to HBO for them to adapt it reasonably well for a long period of time and then run out of what he wrote and start making stupid stuff up. This works very, very well in a tabletop role-playing game setting. The reason it works so well is because we do practice an emergent storytelling medium where you have these other players at the table who are going to add their own change, their own decisions, and their own directions that are going to help polish things out in your world. So because you're only taking a framework, it's not going to be quite as obvious. That being said, you still have to make the necessary adjustments. This just helps you if you're not somebody who is really good at thinking about geopolitical influences on different nations and how economies interacted in the Middle Ages or anything of that nature. You can just say, this is the time period for my game, this is the kind of stuff that I'm looking to emulate. Let me jump on Google and find something similar in history that I can then pull my framework out of. So all I have to do is polish and put on the details. I don't actually have to build the structure. So the number 3 tip for shortcuts you can use in your world building is to adopt a gonzo theme. Now, I spoke earlier in the last video about many times about how the theme of your world is very important, how one of the core things you have to do as a world builder for these games is to always keep the theme in mind and influence how you make decisions. Well, one of the ways you can do that is by adopting a theme that is pervasive. So first, let's start with the definition of gonzo. Gonzo comes from what was referred to as gonzo journalism, which was considered to be exaggerated, excessive, and extremely subjective, and generally from an internal point of view. And when we talk about gonzo fantasy or gonzo sci-fi, what we're talking about is that it's very much wrapped up in the crazy fantastical elements, not so much anything else. And when we adopt a gonzo theme, bizarre, outlandish, beyond the realm of reason, this is when we say, have a world that's entirely dualistic. And I mean, it is good, evil, black, white, wet, dry. I mean, everything is a black and white, and it permeates the entire world, and it permeates all the society. down to the point, and this is where it gets to be quote unquote gonzo. Normally, like, let's say you had a dualistic society that was very much everything's black and white, everything's right and wrong, good and evil. That may be the overarching theme of everything. That may be what the powers that be promote, but the individual people are still going to be multiple shades of gray because they're individual people. However, if you create a world where that black and white dualism penetrates everything down to the regular people, and the players maybe are kind of outside of that, that can work for you, and it can make your world building a lot easier because you can be very player focused. This is great. I mean, it's not even ironic because it's great for more of an adventure style game, or kind of like the zero prep OSR stuff where you're really just kind of sitting back and watching the players do their thing, and that's where everything emerges from. It really works well for that because it keeps your world building minimalist because everybody operates on this spectrum. It makes very binary decisions for all your NPCs. An example of this in literature is the Orwell classic 1984. Orwell crafted a world that was an extreme gonzo version of communism. That's what ingsoc is. Ingsoc is the extreme end game of communism, according to George Orwell. That allowed him to focus on developing the characters of Winston and Julia, of O'Brien, and everything else that was in there, all of which didn't exist within that extreme. The world was an extreme that allowed them to grow in it and in opposition to it. But his world building was made very, very simple because all he had to do was, in any case where he was not focused on the personality or the direct personal impact on the individual character, all he had to do was ask himself, black, white, yes, no, good, bad, and then plug it in. That is how you can use a gonzo theme. If you have an extremely simplistic theme that you've decided to put to your world, something that's very on the nose, very upfront, it keeps the periphery of your world building very contained and very easy, and it makes it to where it's extremely simple for you to answer questions when the players start poking at the edges. They start poking at the edges, there's just more black and white beyond it. There's not a lot of gray there. This is also very good for characters or for players who like to really explore their characters and ask about things like, why does their character do this? Why does their character think that? It gives them a lot of those questions and allows you to focus on the individual adventure as well. So that's one tip that can make your world building easier. Now, it's going to lead to, well, a very gonzo world. It's going to be a very just stark world that you're operating in. If you think about the Kevin Costner movie Waterworld, there's not a lot of world building that has to go on there. Hey, whatever disaster or whatever caused us to have giant ocean world and everybody lives on floating boats. We don't need any more world building than that. Everybody's just trying to survive floating on the floating boats. And I can treat each individual floating boat literally as an island of its own personality that doesn't affect anything else in that world. If I put my players on a water world game setting, I've just made a gonzo theme that has limited my world building to what is immediately impacting my players. For our fourth tip, we're going to go back to what's going to become a kind of a common theme here, and that is that a lot of these shortcuts for world building revolve around the question, what if? Those two words, what if? You look at our historical shorthand example from earlier, what if the Napoleonic era happened in a cyberpunk setting? What if World War I happened in the Dark Ages? And, gonzo, what if the world was dualistic and it's all good or evil? What if it was a direct hand of these two aspects of God that influence everything? What if every single person lived under the hammer of communism? Mirror, Mirror is a classic episode of Star Trek, and it led to what they refer to as the Mirror Universe, which is literally just a universe that has a inverse parallel to the primary universe. It's not the United Federation of Planets diplomatically and peacefully exploring the universe. It's the Terran Empire, evilly and corruptly conquering everything. People are all being promoted not through merit and cooperation. They're being promoted through treachery and backstabbing and sabotage. So a cheap world building trick that can be used is the mirror mirror principle. Now, we're not going to say the mirror mirror principle in some kind of a Dungeons and Dragons context or cyberpunk context, where you literally just take the existing game world and palette swap everything over to the opposite and then say, we're playing this but opposite world. What I'm talking about as a shorthand trick is using kind of the same thing as the historical shorthand, where we take examples from history, from cinema, from books we've read, from ancient myths, and we ask that what if question in what if they were the opposite. Take a Greek myth and say, what if Zeus was not a self-centered, hedonistic, selfish bastard? What would it be like? What if Hercules had some little bit of moral guidance and used his strength for different purposes? What if Julius Caesar was rejected by the Roman people instead of a hero of the common man? What if Napoleon was never defeated at Trafalgar or Waterloo? Or what if he never invaded Russia? What if it happened in the Middle Ages? What if it happened in the cyberpunk age? We take different things that happened in history, different things that happened in stories, we flip them. We ask those questions and how it would adjust or how it would impact the climate within the parties involved, and then we plug it into our game and we move our players there. We plug that into our game world, and the next thing you know, you have a medieval fantasy setting where there is a glorious empire that takes care of everybody, or a glorious republic that takes care of everybody and provides everything, while there's an evil rebellion faction that's trying to establish an empire. It's a global nation. Global republic is trying to be taken over by these people who are global imperialists. Now, the core of your world building efforts have to be focused on making certain things make sense. Generally, you're not going to have an imperialistic rebel faction because imperialism requires a degree of autocratic power, which is generally not going to get people on board to move forward. You have to have something else that causes that. But that's where the what if comes in. What if it was the rebels who were bad guys and the empire who were good guys? Why would they be rebelling? Why would people join this rebellion if the empire is so good? What if this happened, and why is it there? What has to change to make it work? But at least the pieces and the geopolitical figures and the attitudes are in place for you to go ahead and make those minute changes, and that's going to help you take your world and more easily accomplish your goals, particularly if you're not a very creative person who can kind of create this stuff from whole cloth and build it from the bottom. It's a lot easier to say, well, I want to do this. Once again, just like our palette swap example, let me find something that's very similar and make adjustments to it and then plug that in, rather than trying to just make something up from the beginning, because I'm going to tell you right now, there's nothing original under the sun. Now, the next two tips, I really struggled on whether or not I wanted to put them together or keep them separate, because they kind of go hand in hand. But I went ahead and separated them. And number 5 is going to be practicing emergent world building. This is a shortcut technique that comes with a big asterisk on it. And the reason it's got a big asterisk is because in order to practice emergent world building in an effective way that still produces a lived-in, breathed-in world that the players can get immersed in and doesn't end up just being kind of a splatter of random decisions and random tables, is if you are somebody who can be very, very dedicated to their theme and can really keep the theme always in the back of their head. B, are somebody who is very able to think on their feet. And C, you have to be the kind of game master who kind of has a base understanding of a lot of these principles. It's not going to work super well for somebody who, for instance, doesn't really have a vision for geopolitical consequences, or doesn't have a good a good way to get that 1,000-yard view of how if this group of people does one thing, it's going to affect this people this way. Because when you practice emergent storytelling, what you do is your world building is the framework, and it's only the framework of what is immediately around and affecting the players themselves. And then as the players move through the world, and as the players discover the world itself, as they begin to poke and push and ask questions, that is when you actually develop the world. So I'm going to use a hex crawl map as an image for this, as something to put in your head. If you imagine a hex crawl, you got your 5-sided hex, and then there's pieces all around that hex, right? Each side, it touches a certain, touches 5 other hexes. When you're doing this emergent world building, basically you want to have the hex they're in figured out. You want to have an idea for each hex that's touching it, and then you just want to have a concept for everything beyond that. And as they expand the world itself, as they continue to explore and move, that is where the world building itself is going to emerge. Basically, when they push, in our example, they push to that next hex, that expands the level of what needs detail, what needs an idea, and what simply needs a concept. This only works if you are able to keep that theme firmly in mind and can make those kind of judgments on the fly of how things would act. Because as your players keep moving, and not necessarily physically moving, but as they keep moving into different aspects of the world, and you have to expand those, you have to always you have to do it quickly, because a lot of times you're going to be doing it in real time. When you're doing your session prep and whatnot before the next session, you're only really getting a good plan for the stuff that you think they will immediately do. And as any game master with any experience will tell you, the number one thing players like to do is the one thing that you didn't think about or plan on. So it does require on that micro scale a lot more focus, but you are allowing the story to emerge at the table. They're not just poking at the edges of your world, they're literally pushing the boundaries of your world further out. So this takes a lot less time, but it does take a lot more care, because your in-game decisions, you have to sit down at that table with a set of scenarios in mind and have that theme of your game there so that your world makes sense when all those pieces are done. This is literally like discovering a puzzle one piece at a time, but never being able to pick up a piece because it's not really the correct one that went there. The last tip I have today to make your world building easier as a game master for a tabletop role-playing game is limiting your scope. Like I said, this works very well with the emergent world building tip that I just gave a second ago. And the reason's because it's really just part of the emergent world building. When I say limiting your scope, what I'm talking about is, once again, relying heavily on your theme to fill in the blanks of the rest of the world, but all of your world building focus goes on where your players are at right now. One of the distinct advantages that we have as game masters over an author or a screenwriter or a script writer is our characters, our players are going to tell us where the story goes. They are going to do things. They are going to operate within this world. They're going to operate within what we've given them, and they're going to give us the impetus for where things are going and where the future is moving. Whereas if you're a writer or you're a screenwriter or you're creating a script, there's a plan for where the story's headed in advance. There's way more than just an outline. A lot of times you have the beginning and the end are the first two parts of the story that get made. You already know what story you're trying to tell, what beats you're trying to hit, and what parties are going to be coming into play more in the future. So you can't really limit your scope that much because you already have these other outside features, and you have to think about them because you know where everything's going. As a game master, since the players are going to have an active role in determining the direction of where things are going and how they're moving, if we limit our scope to what is immediately in the vicinity of the characters, anything we do, we can always stop and address later. It's very easy for us to retcon things that the players have never even come across in our world building as game masters, because it's not anything that they've ever known. It's not anything they've ever heard or seen. We can make the adjustment. We can build a town or a village, small city, that the players spend a lot of time in. They meet NPCs. Those NPCs mention things in offhand ways that they never talk about. But it gives us things to world build off of later. So, for example, you're playing Cyberpunk. You meet some out-of-town guy. He mentions that he came from Redford, up north. Okay? All we've talked about is Redford up north. Later, if the characters need to get out of someplace or go somewhere, hey, there's a bus to Redford. We have a seed for why he needs to go to Redford. We haven't done anything with it. Redford was not part of our original world building. Redford doesn't even really exist other than as an offhand line from an NPC. However, we got it because players asked a character that was more fleshed out, more information about himself in an earlier mission. He mentioned, yeah, I'm from Redford up north and this is happening up there. And then later when they had to get out of there and get to a safe house, we had something tailor-made. It's sitting in our game notes. We fleshed it out in our spare time. And we have now the players, oh man, it's already there, man. He thought about this way back in session 1, our first mission. He thought this way, man, this is such intricate world building. I can't believe he had all this stuff wrapped up and tied together, and that he had these seeds planted so early on. He didn't. All he did was focus all of his world building on the limited scope of the immediate area, and then when the session was over, he went back to his session notes and said, these things were mentioned, so I need to go ahead and put some notes down for them, so that later, if it comes up that they're a convenient thing for me to plug into what the players are doing to give them some place to go or something to do, then I can flesh that out, and each piece of this world that they encounter and that they interact with becomes a more fleshed out, more precise world that appears to be something that was always part of this game. Well, guys, that's all I've got for the evening. Like I said, like, share, subscribe, all that good stuff. It really helps me out. I really want to get to 1,000 subs and be able to possibly monetize this channel by the end of the year, just so I can use it to fund some of these projects. I'd love to hear what people think about the driving videos versus the car restoration videos, what people would think about what the next project should be or what the next thing they'd like to see on the Z is. I'd love to hear more about what your questions regarding world building and tabletop role-playing games are. And like I said, I'm supposed to sit down with the RPG Pundit this Sunday. I'm really looking forward to that. I hope to see you guys there. Go play your games. Go play and enjoy your games and enjoy building and crafting new worlds. And I'll see you guys next time.